Today we're going to talk about criteria. And specifically in IO psychology, we often refer to this as the criterion. And what we're meaning by that is criterion is effectively the same as outcome. So broadly speaking, what we're trying to predict in IO psychology is the criteria or the criterion. And the criteria is effectively performance. So performance is the criterion in which most organizations, employees, managers, and IO psychologists are interested in. And performance captures a large area of things to measure. Performance can be simply attendance, whether you're there, quality of work, quantity of work. It can also include both organizational citizenship behaviors, so positive behaviors that help others perform well, and it can also be counter workplace behaviors. In other words, negative behaviors that actually, even though you're performing, your additional behaviors are reducing the performance of others around you. So it's an evaluative standard used to assess the quality of work. So when we think about that, if we're evaluating standards and trying to create a scale that measures the quality, quite honestly, criteria is being used in almost every aspect of our life. We're all making judgments that require criteria. So anytime we're making a choice, we're comparing various things, and to compare them, we're basically looking at them as a criteria, as an outcome. Which is the better outcome for us? So for instance, here's something I found on the web one time. This was years ago, but I thought it was fairly interesting. It is boyfriend criteria. So this was someone making a list of what was important and what needed to be measured to determine who would be a good boyfriend. Well, number one was smart, most important. Two is cute. Three is funny. Four will watch horror movies with me. And five did not pick Charmander as their first Pokemon. I'm not sure which Pokemon you're supposed to pick, but apparently Charmander is a deal breaker. Pluses included glasses, good shoes, good tattoos, likes art, comics, and reads. Minuses, annoying, too tight pants, bad tattoos, think you're so smart. Started to say sports but decided against it, bad hair, bad music, but like really bad. Now again, what we're looking at is we now not only have the criteria for this person's boyfriend, we also have a little bit of rank order. We have the 5 most important things, and these are probably the most important things to then measure if you were trying to make an informed choice. If we were actually using this, excuse me, as a hiring technique, this would effectively be our job analysis. The most important thing, the most important part of being this is their intelligence. So we'd probably want a cognitive ability test. Cute and funny might be more subjective, but we might try to capture that in, for example, an interview. We'll watch horror movies. We might have them actually list the types of movies they want, so we might have a checklist which lets us know who actually does this. And finally, of course, we'd have the question of the following Pokemon, which one would you pick first? Now, we might also then have secondary lists of things that may not be as important to the job, but are still worth considering, which would also be weighted less. When I actually had a choice to move offices at SIUE, one of the things I did was I actually tried to make the decision based on multiple factors. So again, I tried to make a list of what was important to me. So this was my older office. It actually was not in the main part of the psychology department. It wasn't in one of the main offices. It was off to the side. And that actually, to a small degree, was an advantage. That meant that there wasn't constantly people coming in and out of the main office on business. It was quieter, but it also was out of the way. So one of the advantages was the quietness or the peacefulness of the office. One of the disadvantages was I wasn't really in the flow of the psychology department. There was also some issues as far as the furniture that was available in the 2 office spaces I was looking at, the way the offices were laid out, and finally the actual office space itself, how large it was. I created a list for both of them before I actually decided to move. And indeed, I'm no longer in this office. I'm now in one of the offices in the main actual psychology suite. So again, I didn't just make a gut decision. I tried to decide what was important about an office and which one of the 2 office spaces was the better fit for my needs. Another example of this is we also want to make sure that when we're creating criteria, we're making sure that we actually understand what the criteria truly is. So for example, this is starting to become a little bit of a dated story, but about close to 8 years ago now, my significant other, my wife, was working for a corporate company, and the building she worked at actually was basically corporate consultants and financiers. So basically people that did financial work. Most of the cars parked in her parking lot were BMWs, Mercedes Benzes, or nicer. In fact, she'd often send me pictures of the cars she was parking next to. Now, at the time we were fresh out of grad school, she was driving a beat up Ford Focus. So she expressed to me a desire to get a car more in line with her job, and I said, not a problem. We had the finances to do it, we had job security, so we were going to look for cars. And on our way to look for cars, I had already built in my head what I thought the criteria was. I thought we were looking for probably not a new, but probably within a year or two used BMW or Mercedes-Benz four-door sedan, something that said, a little bit of status. When we got to the car dealerships, I immediately noticed that I had put together the wrong criteria, and my wife had a different set of criteria. She wanted an American muscle car. That's what she wanted to park next to those Mercedes-Benz. And it turns out this actually made some sense, because what I didn't realize is she wasn't just kind of concerned with what her car looked like where she went to work. Most of her clients were blue-collar industrial companies, companies that did steel work, companies that actually made things, companies where when she pulled into the parking lot, most of that parking lot was filled with trucks and sports cars. So she wanted something that fit in both. And this is indeed what we ended up buying at that time. She wanted the Chevy Camaro. So again, this is just a reminder that we all have criteria, but as a consultant, it's also important to make sure that you are understanding what the client thinks is the criteria, and not just jump forward with your own opinions. So many, if not most, HR decisions do require criteria if we're actually wanting to apply data to those decisions. So training, who is trained, how we assess whether the training is successful, and whether the training is transferred to the workplace, all require a criteria. So if you're trying to target people to get training because they're not performing well, how do you know they're not performing well? Once you're giving the training, to determine whether or not they actually learn what they're supposed to learn in the training. That is knowledge, and that's the criteria of the training. And finally, probably more important than even the learning, is do they apply that training back to the workplace? Does it actually impact performance? That is the ultimate criteria. Did your training actually not only give them the knowledge they need, fill in the gap in their skill set, but also make it to where they were better at their job? Any type of organizational change, now, anytime we're changing an organization, it should be driven by a need to increase overall performance or overall productivity. Why are we changing an organization? Usually because we want to see a change in how productive the organization is. That's a criteria. Obviously, individual performance appraisal, by its very nature, is measuring the criteria or criterion of performance. If we're doing selection, we're trying to select people that will do well in the job. So we're basically trying to predict how their future performance will be. And finally, if we're trying to validate any selection tests, obviously we're going to need some form of criteria or criterion, in other words, a measure of performance, to find out, does our tests in selection actually predict future performance? So in fact, criterion-related validity or validation is the process of checking our selection techniques against eventual performance. Now, generally speaking, we want to develop the criteria first and then the predictor. So that's ideally. Ideally, we should already know what performance in a job is, hopefully driven by a job analysis. And therefore, we can come up with a series of ways to measure that criterion, to measure performance. And then based on the job performance, job analysis, and the actual criterion, we can select proper predictors to use in selection. And this kind of gets us to that idea, and again, we're talking about what we should do, of the ultimate criteria, conceptual criteria, and actual criteria. So the ultimate criterion is the overall contribution to the organization. The ultimate criterion is a goal. It is probably never attainable because it represents all possible behaviors, actions, and skills that you apply in your job to the benefit of the organization. And honestly, to try to truly measure the ultimate criterion, we would have to be spending an enormous amount of time measuring people in multiple ways. The conceptual criterion is more of an ideal set of factors that define quality and is specifically influenced by organizational goals. So the ultimate criterion is absolute, complete, perfect measurement of anything that is performance in an organization. The conceptual criterion is an ideal set of factors. In a perfect world, But being reasonable, what would we want to measure to capture performance in any particular job, specifically defined by the organization's goals itself? The actual criterion is what we actually measure. So it's measures that hopefully reflect the conceptual criteria and strive towards the ultimate criteria, but are bound by the realities of both time, effort, and cost. So for instance, looking at my job as a faculty member, generally speaking, I'm going to start with the conceptual criterion. The conceptual criterion of a professor is usually broken up into three broad areas, and that is research, that is service, and that is teaching. But the ultimate criteria would also include all sorts of OCBs. They would include my overall personality. They would include my willingness to help others. There would be a lot of other factors we would try to capture if we were truly trying to capture every single thing I bring to help an organization. The conceptual criteria, though, is that ideal set of factors. Well, a faculty member needs to teach classes and teach them well. They need to be able to do the various service goals and service jobs that are required to keep the department and the university running. And they finally need to do research to further the field of whatever field they're in my case, industrial organizational psychology. And we might come up with 2 or 3 actual measures of each of these, and those are the actual criteria. So for example, research. I actually every year, I have to put together a list of every presentation that I've submitted, every grant that I've obtained, and every publication that I've gotten, and where they've been published, where they were presented, and how much the grant is. That's the actual criterion. Now, does that capture everything I do as far as research? No, it doesn't capture meetings with students. It doesn't necessarily capture theses, but it's the actual criterion that's fairly easy to operationalize. So you can kind of see these three processes, and we want to keep them in mind when we're working on creating a measure of performance. What is the goal? What is the ultimate criterion? And again, you're never going to even be able to think of everything, but you want to start with that big cloud. If I could measure anything and everything to do with performance, what would be that measure? What would be that series of measures? What would be that series of constructs? Then can I conceptualize that into 2, 3, maybe 5 big areas that are pretty key to being measured? And again, the job analysis is really going to help you do the conceptual criterion. And once I have that conceptual criterion, often lifted directly from a job analysis, note the importance of job analysis, we can actually then start grabbing specific operations or specific measures, trying to make sure we at least have a measure of each of those conceptual constructs or important factors. So when we're talking about the relationship between the actual and conceptual criteria, we want to look for 3 possibilities. We want to look for relevance, deficiency, and contamination. So relevance refers to that we have an actual criterion that actually captures a major part of the conceptual criterion. So this is the extent to which the actual and the conceptual criterion overlap. So if the conceptual criterion is all possible research, and the actual criterion is simply how many publications do I have a year, there would be a fair amount of overlap there. Maybe not complete, but that does capture at least a portion of getting my research out and acknowledged. Deficiency is the degree to which an actual criterion incompletely represents the conceptual criterion. So basically, one of the things that might be measuring is simply quantity, not quality. So we can have someone that actually had a whole bunch of publications, so they look better by quantity, but none of them were in very prestigious journals, and almost none of those articles ever got cited by anyone. That would be a deficiency. I am capturing research, but I'm not capturing it as well as I would like, and I may actually miss the part where another person that only has 1 publication, so they quantitatively look like they're not performing as well, but that 1 publication was in a top-tier journal and has already gotten hundreds of citations. So again, we're not going to get to the perfect measure of our criterion, in this case, performance and research, but relevance is how well we're actually capturing it. Deficiency is what we may be missing. Contamination is beyond deficiency. It means the actual criterion is measuring something other than the conceptual criteria. So for example, this is usually going to be either error, mood, fatigue, unstandardized instructions, but often it may also be bias, group membership, knowledge of predictor information. So for example, if, for instance, I actually again have that simply numerical count of research papers that have been accepted, However, there has been studies that have found that certain people from non-dominant groups or minority groups have less opportunities and are less likely to get publications. Using a number count may also introduce bias to where certain advantage groups are always getting higher scores and certain disadvantaged groups are always getting lower scores. Now, if that truly captures their ability to do research, it may not be contamination. But if both of them are doing good research and one of them is just having problems getting it published, but all I'm doing is measuring publication rates, that potentially could be contamination. Now, relevance, deficiency, and contamination, much like ultimate, conceptual, and actual criterion, are more of kind of thought exercises. A lot of times we can't know for sure if something has relevance, deficiency, or contamination, but if we think in these terms, it helps us get closer. It's a structure. It's a way of thinking or a framework that helps us design better criterion, better measures of performance. So again, ideally, we want our conceptual and our actual to have relevance, and that's where the actual criterion actually measures the conceptual criterion. So that's criterion relevance, degree to which the actual criterion matches the conceptual. Criterion deficiency is the degree to which the actual criterion fails to represent. In other words, what part of the actual conceptual criterion did our actual criterion miss? For example, quality of publications. And finally, criterion contamination at the bottom is the aspect of actual criterion that is measured. So the criterion is capturing it, but it actually has nothing to do with what we're trying to measure, the conceptual criterion. This is error and bias. So having said all of that, and remember I said that ideally we want to have a solid measure of performance or criteria before we ever create selection techniques, the reality is that we rarely do this. We are still effectively in a dark ages of criterion. We have an enormous amount of science and literature about the predictors, so how to measure cognitive ability, how to measure motivation, how to measure various personality traits. However, when we look at organizations, we rarely find nuanced, well thought through measures of actual performance. So the joke that's often made is that we have the Mercedes of predictors and the Yugo of criteria. Now, if you were alive 25, 30 years ago, the Yugo reference would make sense, but it was basically a Yugoslavian car that came out before the Cold War ended. And it was extremely cheap. A lot of people started buying them, but because it was very cheap, it also was not very good. It tended to break down, it was hard to work on, and most people that bought a Yugo quickly regretted it. So this is basically referring to the idea that we have an extremely high performance, well scientifically backed methodology, practice, and science of measuring predictors, while most organizations are still functioning with a Yugo of measuring performance. It is not uncommon to find that when you go into an organization, and this I'm talking as an independent consultant, and this has happened to me multiple times, where they have a expensive, well thought out selection system, interviews, personality assessments, cognitive ability assessments, all of them well backed with science, structured interviews. It looks great, and they ask me to validate it to make sure it's working. And I ask them, well, what's your performance measure? And they say once a year a manager marks them as high or low. One single measure done once a year, and it's a dichotomous categorical variable. There's not a lot you can do with that, and honestly it's not very useful to decision making. So this is an argument that is ongoing in the field of IO psychology. Basically speaking, most organizations do not want to put the time and effort and money into really measuring performance successfully, especially when they can kind of get a feel for it in a lot of jobs. In other words, you don't necessarily need a beautiful set of tools to know if someone's not doing their job. Now, to be able to tell who's doing their job the very best, that might be a little bit harder to do. But anyway, we still have this kind of feeling that organizations aren't willing to do it. Not only that, individual managers will often report if we do instigate an advanced, well scientifically backed measure of performance that it takes too much of their time and it's too exhaustive to do. So Campbell in 1993, so over 20 plus years ago, in fact a quarter of a century ago, argued that IO psychology needed a theory of job performance that would strongly drive the measure of job performance. Honestly, not a lot of progress has been made in those 25 plus years. In fact, the current trend in IO psychology is a lot of organizations trying to just not measure criterion at all anymore, to assume that all of their employees are top performers and to stop measuring performance. What is interesting, though, is this is often done citing the bias in having managers just rate people. And they're probably right. You are getting bias if all a manager is doing is subjectively deciding who's their top and bottom performers. But by removing performance measures completely, what are you left with? Someone still has to decide who gets trained and who doesn't. Someone still has to decide who gets the promotion and who doesn't. And what's happening is that as you remove any form of performance measure, you're moving more and more to some upper level management making that decision. And instead of them making it on any kind of systematic decision, it's going back to their gut, which is probably even more bias ridden. So we're going to have to see where this plays out, but just recognize that most organizations understand and fully endorse the need for scientifically backed and even expensive measures for selection. They often fight doing the same for actual measures of performance. And there's a bit of a reason. Measuring performance is difficult. So you have to remember that performance is also impacted strongly by the environment and time. So performance measures, even good ones, may change over time. Typically, we find performance measures, again, scientifically backed, well-developed performance measures, will tend to be highly related at closer time periods, but may show higher relationships. But if you look at two different measures of performance in individuals over a long period of time, you often find smaller relationships or even non-existent relationships. Now, part of this can be the learning curve as people learn the organization, but also any change event tends to have a negative effect on an organization. So anytime you have the status quo, solid performance, and you change an organization, there will be a relearning, there will be chaos, there will be a reduction in performance. And then that fine-tuning may result in overall improvement in performance. But again, think about this chart off to the right. Depending when you measured performance, you may find very different ratings of performance if you're measuring it properly. So that is also a difficulty, is that not only do we want to be able to measure performance, we also want to recognize the impact of situations, environments, and even the economy on performance. People's performance do change depending on what's going on in the world. And we found this statistically as well. So the idea of dynamic criteria or dynamic performance is strongly supported by research. Hoffman, Jacobs, and Jarvis in 1992 actually looked at basically decades of batting averages of baseball players and earned run averages. And generally they found overall across all players some evidence that performance was consistent. But they also found that some players consistently improved over time, other players consistently declined over time, and others changed in less systematic ways. Which meant that though on average performance slightly got better as people got more experience, practiced more, and played more. But overall, that wasn't necessarily predictive of everyone. And that again gets this idea that even when you're measuring performance well, you may not get very nice, highly correlated graphs out of it. And that's also one of the reasons why it's harder to sell to organizations. Why should we be doing this if we can't even necessarily rely on this data without an extremely complex model? And it's also one of the reasons that, again, there's been a press over the last quarter decade to try to come up with a better theory to incorporate these concepts, such as the effects of time, the effects of the environment, and the effects of dynamic criteria.